Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Simon Levin, Moffett, Professor of Biology, Princeton University. My name is Lok Yu. I'm a physicist from the School of Physical and Mathematical Science, NTU. My first introduction to Simon Levin was through Steve Lansing, as we work on the problem of coupled socio-ecological system. Steve introduced me to a very interesting paper by Simon titled The Survival of the Conformist, Social Pressure, and Renewed Resource Management. I later learned that Simon Levin is a world expert in ecology. He is famous in applying mathematics to ecological systems. In 2004, Simon was awarded the Dr. A.H. Hannigan Prize for Environmental Science for his insight on the effects of scales in ecosystems. And in 2005, he was awarded the Kyoto Prize in Basic Sciences. It is a prestigious award with international recognition given to groups and individuals who contributed significantly for the betterment of mankind. Simon's training is in the field of mathematics. He received his BA in mathematics from the Johns Hopkins University and his PhD in mathematics from the University of Maryland. Simon specializes in using mathematical modeling and empirical studies in understanding macroscopic patterns in ecosystem and biodiversity. His principal research interest is to understand how these macroscopic patterns are determined by ecological and evolutionary mechanisms at the level of the organism. I believe his major contribution is in the elucidation of ecological processes or ecological phenomena that is best understood by knowing what is going on at different orders of scales. This thesis, in fact, is expounded in a very highly cited article by him titled The Problem of Scale and Pattern in Ecology. I would like to quote a paragraph from this paper. In fact, when I read it, it gave me a knock in my head, so I'm sorry that I really need to read this paragraph. To scale from the leaf to the ecosystem, to the landscape and beyond, we must understand how information is transferred from fine scales to broad scales and vice versa. We must learn how to aggregate and simplify, retaining essential information without getting bogged down in unnecessary detail. The essence of modeling is, in fact, to facilitate the acquisition of this understanding by abstracting and incorporating just enough detail to produce observed patterns. A good model does not attempt to reproduce every detail of the biological system. The system itself suffices for that purpose as the most detailed model of itself. Rather, the objective of a model should be to ask how much detail can be ignored without producing results that contradict specific sets of observations on particular scales of interest. As I read this paragraph, I realized that Simon is teaching us how to take a crude look at the whole. And finally, and in fact in this context, I would also like to introduce you all to a delightful book by Simon titled fragile dominion, complexity, and the commons. In this book, Simon indicates how the new science of complexity can help to solve our looming ecological crisis, and he also argues in this book that our biosphere is a complex, adaptive system. I believe by now you're willing to listen to Simon's presentation. So let us put our hands together to welcome Professor Simon Levin to the stage.
Thank you very much. I was worried when you said that paragraph gave you a knock in the head that translated into a headache, but I'm not sure. You'll have to tell me later. Okay, we may think of ecosystems as enduring parts of nature, but in fact, ecosystems and the biosphere are dynamic, and there's lots of turnover in what species composition will be at any particular place, especially on local scales. But despite that, when we think about particular ecosystems and what we want to sustain and protect about them, we're thinking about characteristic regularities, macroscopic patterns that characterize them, whether we're talking about forests or aquatic systems or marine systems. These crude regularities, indeed this is a crude look at the whole, characterize what are called biomes. And so starting with Holdridge, going through Whitaker and others, there have been various attempts to characterize where you would expect to find particular kinds of vegetation in relationship to temperature and precipitation. So you know, for example, where you should find desert, where you should find tropical rainforests, where you might find savannas and other grasslands. But as you'll see, this is only an approximation. First of all, it doesn't tell you what species to expect to find. It only tells you the vegetation type. And secondly, as you'll see, there's still some uncertainty within these regions. The characteristic patterns that I refer to are things like species abundance relationships, stoichiometry, patterns of nutrient cycling. These are emergent. They're emergent properties that make the ecosystem operate, but they are the collective properties of many different species cooperating together, and yet the ecosystem hasn't been selected like an organism has for its particular properties. This is rather the transformational evolution of the system to something that works. So this implies, at least to me, a need to relate phenomena across scales, going from cells to organisms, some of which we've already seen at this meeting, from organisms to groups of organisms, from groups of organisms to ecosystems, ultimately to the biosphere, and to ask questions like, how robust are the properties of ecosystems that we care about? How does the robustness at the macroscopic scale, the robustness of the macroscopic properties, depend on things that are going on in much finer scales of space, of time, of organizational complexity, on both ecological and evolutionary time scales? Can we develop a statistical mechanics of ecological communities, and ultimately, you will see, of coupled human and environmental systems? Now, sustainability is something we've heard a good deal of talk about at this meeting. It's something most of us are concerned about. If we're interested in sustainability, we need to focus on the macroscopic properties, but we have to understand how it relates to phenomena at the microscopic scale. Something analogous to this cartoon of what would happen if I had a particular gas or a liquid in which I was applying pressure. There will be phase transitions that will occur. These are the result of the interactions among many individual molecules, but they're not sensitive to the details of what any one molecule will do. So somehow we have to develop, as physics has, a statistical mechanics, a thermodynamics, that takes us from the individual interactions to the collective properties, the emergent properties, that really can't be inferred from just the details of local interactions. So I think a perspective from complexity theory, from mathematics, from physics, can help with a lot of features of this. First of all, in developing a statistical mechanics of ecological community and understanding when they are likely to undergo or about to undergo critical transitions, the collective phenomena that give rise to the patterns, like I showed you at the beginning, of bird flocks and fish schools, collective motion, which also exhibit emergence and pattern formation, and for which a statistical mechanical approach, but much more difficult than when we're dealing with molecules because individuals are moving actively. They're nonlinear interactions. And finally, at the end, dealing with, I think, and as we heard from some of the speakers in the last 2 days, in dealing with global problems, the problems of conflict and how do we take collective action to address problems that concern us all. This was something that Murray raised in his opening remarks. So let me turn to these topics one at a time. Statistical mechanics of ecological communities. It's very easy, even with the simplest models of competition, to observe the emergence of pattern. This is a stochastic model, an interacting particle model, stochastic cellular automata that Rick Durrett and I looked at years ago of competition between two species. And all that's going on here are local interactions, but as a result of that, pattern forms. The system leads to aggregation of the two types of competitors into groups, and in this case, the ultimate elimination of one type by the other. More realistic models have been looked at for a long time in dealing, for example, with forest communities. My colleague Steve Pacala, along with Dan Botkin and Henk Schugert and others, have been building individual-based models of forest communities. This is a simulation that we published in Science some years ago, my student Doug Deutschmann, in which we grow temperate forests. And the way these models run is that you take detailed measurements that have been made on individual plants, how they grow, how they shade each other out, and from that, run simulations, and patterns are emergent that show great similarity to what one actually observes in real communities. Now, our objective in looking at that was to ask the question, how can we reduce the complexity of these interactions of many species to capture the emergent properties? Models of this sort have been extended up to much broader scales, to regional scales, to national scales, to global scales, producing maps of this sort that tell you where you would expect to find particular kinds of vegetation. In this case, at this scale, you wouldn't expect to be able to specify which species to see there, but you should be able to group species into aggregations and make robust predictions. Similar sorts of models have been developed in particular by Mick Follow's group at MIT, working with Penny Chisholm and others. And what Follows and his group have done is both through simulations and through these analytical models, is to write down equations for the dynamics of interactions between species, embedded it all in a fluid dynamic framework that reflects what's known about the oceans. And this is a standard sort of model that you break into three categories: nutrients, phytoplankton, zooplankton. There are no fish in this model. Ultimately, there need to be. But each of these types is broken into individual species. And what Follows did, and his group, were to take essentially a menu of different kinds of species that could be. There are hundreds of species that were put into competition with each other, allow them to compete with each other, and to ask what patterns emerge. And indeed, repeatedly, although they would get different details as to which species, those weren't real species anyway, they were particular characteristics of species. They were able to predict not where individual species would be found, but where individual ecotypes would be found, where the diatoms would be found, where the large eukaryotes would be found, where the group Prochlorococcus, an important bacterial group in the oceans, would be found. And we've been working with Mick and others on these models to try to simplify them. Indeed, whether we're dealing with forests or oceans or similar models in other systems, the challenge is to simplify these descriptions by aggregation and other coarse-graining methods, methods that will help us take the detailed models, develop the statistical mechanics, and try to predict what sorts of emergent patterns that we will see. All of this is because, as we've heard ever since the beginning of this meeting, ecosystems and the biosphere are what are called complex adaptive systems. That is, they're systems that are made up of individual agents. Those agents interact with each other on local scales. As a result of those interactions, there are changes in behaviors, or maybe even changes over evolutionary time, There are patterns that emerge, and those patterns then feed back to affect individual behavior. So there are dynamics that go on multiple scales, but not just ecosystems and the biosphere, but also the socio-economic systems with which they are linked are complex adaptive systems. And that means that the dynamics of these systems plays out on multiple spatial and temporal and organizational scales, that they self-organize, that patterns result, and that there's consequent unpredictability. Brian Arthur taught us years ago about path dependence in economic systems. These systems have multiple stable states, multiple stable basins of attractions, path dependence, the potential for hysteresis if they get shifted from one system to another, and the potential, as we saw in the economic crisis, for contagious spread and systemic risk. In other words, the potential for the destabilization of the regimes one's in, and regime shifts either as the result of exogenous changes or as the result of slow time variable evolution endogenously. In 2008, about 6 months before the financial crisis, Bob May and George Sugihara and I wrote a paper in which we said, we don't know much about financial systems, but we've been working in food webs, and the more interconnected those systems get, the more unstable they become. And there's something about the nature of the interconnectedness in financial networks that doesn't look good to us. We said, who knows, for example, for instance, how the present concern over subprime loans will pan out. Now, I wish I had read this paper and not just written it, because I didn't do much about it. But in fact, we know what happened 6 months later. And this paper called Ecology for Bankers, which was published in Nature, has made all of us popular with consulting firms. It seemed to imply that we knew something that we didn't. So the problem of critical transitions is a problem that's evident in this example and has generated a lot of recent interest. Certainly, whenever I go to the Santa Fe Institute, there's discussion of the question, are there indicators that tell you when a system is about to lose its robustness? This is a paper I was involved with that was published last year, I think in Nature, I can't remember if it was Nature or Science, in Science, I guess, called Anticipating Critical Transitions. But this is not a new problem. Certainly in physics, interest in when systems will flip among various states, the transition between different phases is fundamental. And in the 1960s, when I was first starting out in these fields, Rene Thom, the famous mathematician, developed an approach called Catastrophe Theory that wrote down a system of equations that could easily imitate many of the bifurcations that were observed. And indeed, this was a gradient system. The right-hand sides were gradients of polynomials of low degree. And it was the lower degree polynomials that seemed to generate the most interesting phenomena. But as with many of these subjects, catastrophe theory got oversold. If people saw that A could produce B, and they saw B, and they thought, therefore A. Well, it doesn't work that way. A similar thing happens with the attention to power laws. When people see them, they expect some simple explanations. And so catastrophe theory fell into disfavor. But despite the problems of these approaches, it's true that many of the sorts of transitions of interest have characteristic signals. Critical slowing down, the rate at which they return to an equilibrium, seems to get slower as the depth of the basin of attraction gets less. Increasing variance, as we probably are seeing in climate systems now. Increasing autocorrelation, and perhaps even flickering between different basins of attraction. So these signals are there, but signals of this sort are not ubiquitous. For example, Per Bach popularized the notion of self-organized criticality, which shows very different sorts of dynamics than the dynamics that lead to these sorts of transitions. I woke up this morning to find out that the Dow had closed at its highest level ever. So I was inspired to pull out a snapshot that I took out of the paper, off the web that is, a few years ago when I decided to check what was happening with the Dow, and I looked at it and I saw it had lost 100% of its value, dropping down to 0. Now this was a mistake, fortunately, but it was a little shocking to look at, and surprises and big drops can occur, and we know there are days when we've had drops of 10% or so on the Dow. They're not always predictable. Nonetheless, it's well documented that many systems have alternative stable states. Certainly the systems I've been interested in, ecological systems, well documented. This is a paper Bob May wrote in the 70s on thresholds and breakpoints and documenting some of the cases. The Resilience Alliance has on its web site a listing of critical transitions indeed, system flips in a variety of ecological systems. We've been interested in savannas and forests, and we means primarily my student Carla Staver, who got her degree within the past year, and has been working in South Africa, but together with Sally Archibald, a graduate student in South Africa, began looking at remote sensing data sets, the so-called MODIS data sets, and going back to the Whitaker and Holdridge sort of diagram, tried to determine where one ought to expect to find savannas, where one ought to expect to find forests. And there were regions that were deterministically savanna, and indeed the data showed that they were savanna. And there were regions that are deterministically forest, and the data showed that they're a forest. But then there were broad regions, as you see in the middle here, that have the potential to exist in either as forest or savanna. Indeed, if you look at the vegetative cover, you see a bimodality to the distribution. It's not a smooth transition. These are two very different states. And of course, there's a geographical factor. That's not good. There's a geographical factor that's involved here, namely if you're next to a savanna, that's going to bias you towards savanna. But there are these boundary regions that could flip between states. And what we think is going on, by the way, is that changes in precipitation have the potential to drive flips. This is what those areas look like. This is a savanna with some isolated trees within them. This is different than a forested system. There are trees in the savanna. But fire plays an important role. And I'm working with Emmanuel Schertzer, a former postdoc of mine. We're building percolation models to try to understand the spread of fire so we can understand what the potential is for the system to flip from one state to another. Now, why is fire important? Well, grass burns, and the young saplings of the trees that you saw in the middle of the grassland burn. But once the trees get above a certain stage, they're no longer subject to burning. And therefore, fire is a self-sustaining state. And indeed, it's an adaptation for grass to burn so that the grass state becomes self-sustaining. If the trees get above a certain amount, then the system flips into a tree-covered system. The frequency with which fire occurs is going to be a function of the amount of grass that's there. So we can document this sort of function, which will tell us the relationship between fire and the amount of grass, and write down a system of simple differential equations that just says at the start, the whole landscape is broken up into grass, saplings, and trees, just to make it simple, and these are savanna trees, to document within the equations what the transitions rate are, with the critical term being this nonlinear term given by that function up there, which says that the frequency of fire depends on the amount of grass. And when you look at the dynamics of this system, you'll find, by looking at the two isoclines, that you can either have a state that's very low in grass covered with trees, or you can have a state that's very high in grass cover and self-sustaining due to fire. But at intermediate levels of precipitation, there are two stable crossing points. The big red circle, and where these lines cross are equilibria, but where the red circles are, these are stable equilibria, and that's easy to show. And that means that the system has two stable states for the same parameter values, if we draw it in this way, where I borrow and modify a diagram of Martin Scheffer's, then the system can either exist at low vegetation cover or at high vegetation cover. At high levels of precipitation, the grass level is low. At low levels of precipitation, the grass level is high because there are lots of fire. And the system has the potential, if precipitation were to decrease, say, of losing stability and flipping here. And you'd see critical slowing down here. And if precipitation increases, to flip from the high grass state to the high vegetation state. So responses to changes in rainfall status are going to be rapid, they're going to be threshold transitions, and they're going to be difficult to reverse. We see the same sorts of phenomena in other systems. Steve Carpenter and Martin Scheffer and others have demonstrated it in lakes that can flip between eutrophic and oligotrophic, or much healthier systems. We certainly see it in pathogen systems. Forest pests, for example, Buzz Holling's initial work on the spruce budworm, which has this potential for this sudden transition. We also looked at some more detailed models I'm not going to take you through today that incorporate a second type of tree, and these systems actually exhibit much more complicated behavior, heteroclinic cycles that can flip on a periodic basis back and forth between two states. We don't know yet. We're trying to determine from the data whether this is a mathematical artifact or whether this is really meaningful. Now, let me turn to the third topic, which is collective motion and collective phenomena. Many speakers in this meeting have already mentioned Phil Anderson's paper that was the subject of last year's meeting, More is Different. The idea that putting lots of things together will lead to emergent properties that are difficult to predict. We, which means two postdocs, Kelly Kaler and Todd Scanlon, together with Ignacio Rodriguez Iturbe and me, have been interested in vegetation patterns close to those regions I already showed you in Africa. This is in the Kalahari, though. And if you look at satellite data, you will see, if you look at a cluster diagram and you look at the number of patches of vegetation of different sizes, they have a power law sort of relationship. If you build simple models that just put disturbances and allow growth locally, then you don't reproduce these patterns. But if you allow those disturbances to spread locally, then you can reproduce the patterns quite well. So very simple local models can lead to these emergent properties, in this case, power law phenomena. Indeed, there are other patterns in vegetation that have attracted interest for a long time. These are the stripe patterns in the tiger bush. And people have successfully modeled this by borrowing a model of Alan Turing's that many of you may know about because he was interested in problems in developmental biology. Turing asked, how is it that pattern can form endogenously? That is where there's no blueprint and there's no external information. In the case of a developing egg, the only external information is gravity. It's not enough to do it. And he said, well, this could work if you had two interacting morphogens, two interacting chemicals, one of them an activator and the other an inhibitor. The activator stimulates the production of both. The inhibitor damps down the production of both. In a well-mixed medium, they reach some sort of an equilibrium, but if the inhibitor is diffusing at a higher rate, then what happens, or what can happen, is that the activator, by random perturbations, gets a little bit above at some local point. It begins to build up. It stimulates the production of the inhibitor, which begins to build up. But then the inhibitor diffuses away, not doing its job to damp down, and the activator keeps going. Meanwhile, the inhibitor is places it shouldn't be. And that can break symmetry, and you can show that that leads to non-uniform stationary patterns. Basically, what's going on there is short-range activation, long-range inhibition, and you can see these phenomena in other models, and people have applied this to those vegetation systems with a good deal of success, water being the element that's moving there. Probably more success than has been shown in developmental biology systems where searches for these morphogens has not been terribly successful. So we, which means Lee Siegel and I, and separately Akira Okubo, got interested in applying these ideas of Turing to plankton systems where one sees patchiness on almost every scale. And we said, well, maybe the phytoplankton the small plants, are the activators stimulating the production of zooplankton, the inhibitors, which will dampen us down. And so we published a paper in Nature which showed that this could happen. Unfortunately, when you look at the patterns themselves, you see that this doesn't work, because if you look at the patchiness in the system, you'll find that the zooplankton are more patchily distributed than phytoplankton, which is not what should happen with the inhibitor, because the inhibitor is diffusing at a higher rate. So something was wrong, and my student Danny Grunbaum worked on this for his thesis. The problem is that zooplankton don't passively diffuse, so the diffusion model doesn't work for them. They aggregate. And similar problems of this sort have been looked at for a wide variety of these systems in which collective motion is important to pattern. Many people, including us, have worked on this for bacterial pattern formation, bacterial fronts that can grow. The study of slime molds is one of the classic examples in developmental biology. John Bonner, my colleague at Princeton, did the seminal work, but Lee Siegel and Evelyn Keller did a good deal of work on this. Insects swarming, krill, which are small organisms in the ocean, birds, as I'll show you, fish, and ungulates like these. These are wildebeest. And you see these remarkable frontal patterns that arise that seem best modeled just as a hydrodynamic instability of the front due to local attraction and repulsion. So this is a front of wildebeest moving through the Serengeti. But you'll see patterns of this sort for many other species. And in these cases, the problem is, again, the scaling problem. How do we take this crude look at the whole and understand it in terms of the behaviors of individuals? How do we relate the macroscopic patterns to the microscopic rules? Richard Feynman was interested in this. How is it that ants that are moving from A to B end up doing so in a straight line? He had a very simple set of local rules for it, which is not far from true. He said, well, suppose they're moving along on a path of this sort, and each one is only trying to follow the one in front of it. Then this one here eventually will turn and straighten out this line, just moving towards the individual in front of it. So local rules can give rise to emergent patterns that strike us as remarkable. The null hypothesis for movement is a random walk, but the random walk obviously doesn't work very well here. Inter-individual interactions are essential. These are reindeer. And you can see that these guys are going this direction, which presumably is the right direction for some reason. These guys are going that direction. These guys are going the wrong direction because they're following individuals, but eventually they'll end up in the right place, and what else do they have to do? So that these sorts of patterns are emergent patterns from local interactions. Now, Danny's thesis and later work we did with Glenn Flarrell and Don Olson tried to get at this problem by developing a proper statistical mechanics, and I'll just give you a hint of it here. And the way this works is you write down a density function for the velocities and spatial positions of each individual, of all the individuals in the system, that is. And you say this density function changes in a time step delta t. It's the integral of what all of the positions were and densities and velocities at the previous time step multiplied times the transition functions that tell you the likelihood of going from this position to that position. And that either comes from data or from your hypothesis about how things are playing out in this system. Now, if you've got local rules of interaction, and most of the information you get, for example, the data on those birds I showed you before, and on fish say that the birds respond, say, to their 6 or 7 nearest neighbors. I'm not going to talk about that, but there's a whole literature on what rules are used. You've got to somehow translate that into a density. So you take this, you start from an individual-based rule about a Lagrangian rule about how individuals move and how they respond to their neighbors. You develop a statistical description of that, and then you've still got to close up the system in some way by translating a density into the probability that I'm going to see 7 or 6 or 5 or no individuals in my neighborhood. And so I have to use some closure scheme, like assuming that, occurrences locally are locally Poisson. So these work pretty well in many cases in giving you a continuum description of the system. And a picture like you see at the top here, and this is from our paper in which we put aggregation schemes within some Navier-Stokes type flow. And a number of interesting conclusions that occur here. First of all, if the closures are good, these approximations work well. If the closures are not good, then there are some very imaginative schemes designed by Yanis Kevrakidis and others called equation-free methods. What Kevrakidis does is he uses his microscopic simulator to generate the tangent planes, et cetera, that you would need to do bifurcation analysis. So he operates with the microscopic model as if he had the closure to generate the information the closure would give you. One of the things that we observed, and I was really struck by the resonance with what Peter Sloot talked about yesterday with stochastic resonance, is if we put low levels of turbulence into the system, into the fluid dynamics, that made it easier for individuals to find each other. Aggregations form more quickly because individuals were moving around and much more likely to come into contact with each other. But if you tuned up the turbulence to much higher levels, that began to break up the assemblages. So just as he reported yesterday, the most efficient aggregation in this case came about at intermediate levels of turbulence. Very similar phenomenon. But these models work well, but real aggregations are heterogeneous assemblages of individuals, like these birds that I showed you at the beginning. These are starlings. This is given to me by Claudio Carreri. These pictures were taken in Rome, but you can see them other places. And I just came back from Australia, where I saw the flying foxes, the huge bats that are there, going through patterns of this sort. Now, if you're a fluid dynamicist, it's hard to look at this and not think there's a statistical mechanics, there's a fluid dynamical description. By the way, they're not all starlings. This guy right here is a hawk that's driving a lot of these activities. And it may be that this is a collective, that this motion has collective benefits that actually confound the predator. But in any case, there's no obvious leader. Individuals are moving in response to each other. So with my postdoc, Ian Cousin, who's now my collaborator, a member of the faculty at Princeton, I set out, and it really means he said. If I say I mean we, okay? If I say we, I probably mean he, okay? Set out to look at, in his case, it's mainly fish that he's interested in, how these patterns can form and what is the role of leadership. And so we built a simple model. This is a stochastic model. I should tell you, although it won't be evident from what I'm saying, it's a stochastic model. And the idea is that every individual in this has a direction that it's moving, and every individual updates its direction at different time steps in relation to two kinds of information. It's intrinsic information about where it thinks, say, the food is, or where it thinks it ought to go. It doesn't have to be the correct information in this model. That's this G, and D, which is information about its neighbors, information about individuals in some neighborhood, their positions, their velocities. The positional information averages over the positions, the social information averages over the positions and velocities of neighbors. And we update this at each time step according to a rule of this sort. The updated velocity vector is some weighted average of the social vector and the informational vector normalized. So if omega is equal to 0, you do nothing but follow. If omega is infinite, you do nothing but lead. And we did look at some versions in which omega was adaptive. Namely, if you have a high omega but nobody's following you, you lower your omega. Not something most of our political leaders do. So, so in this first video I'll show you, there are 100 individuals, 99 of whom are pure followers, and one who wants to go up to this point here. So that one is the white dot, and there are 99 green dots, and the group doesn't move very effectively. But if I change that 1 to 5, then the 5 find their way to the front, and the group begins to move up there. But if I change that 5 to 10, then the group moves rather efficiently to the front. So we can do this for groups of different sizes, different numbers of leaders, et cetera. And we see that animal groups can be led by a very small number of leaders. This is the proportion of informed individuals. These are groups of different sizes. The larger groups require a smaller proportion, and that's because if you look at the actual number of informed individuals, by the time you get up to 5 or 10, the group is moving about as efficiently as it can. This is a measure of how fast it moves towards that front. Now, that's if all the leaders want to go the same direction. What if they don't? If you have competing preferences, but they're not too different, then the group will split the difference initially. It'll go down the middle. But at some point, it's going to have to make a decision, or else it's going to have to split. And a bifurcation occurs. That's what you see here. Equal number of individuals, 5 in this case, who wanted to go each direction. At some point, half the time the group was going one way and half the other. But you can also get this sort of a behavior in which 5 individuals want to go north and 5 south. I never understand why everybody finds this funny, but they must tell us something about human nature and indecision. So the group split, as you saw. But you can also get this behavior. Remember, this is a stochastic model in which the group goes up there for a while and then it heads down here. And the reason for this is the model's stochastic. So when you get up close to one target, all of the vectors that are pointing to that target are no longer coherent, whereas the ones that go in the other direction are all pointing down there. So this can actually lead to a periodic behavior. It's something like what one expects in a two-party political system, where once the group's in power, infighting becomes more important than getting to the target, because you're so close to the target. Now, what happens? Those were for equal numbers of leaders wanting to go to 2 directions. If there are more leaders that want to go in the other direction, in one direction, then the group will almost always go in that direction in these simple models. So we set out to try to understand these models, and working with Naomi Leonard, who's known to some of you, who's a control engineer interested, and I'll come back to her at the end, interested in putting robots out in the field to gather information. And we modeled this most simply by ignoring explicit space and using a model due to Kuramoto of coupled oscillators. So ignore the summation terms for the moment. What this says is these individuals want to go in direction theta 1 bar. And so we write those equations as theta j dot equals sine of theta 1 bar minus theta j for all those n1 individuals in that group. And if that's all that went on, those individuals would all end up in that direction. And then we have a second group that wants to go in a different direction. And then we have a bunch of followers. And in this model, there's all-to-all coupling, although we relax that later. And everybody is influenced by the average of everybody else in the group. So this is a very simplistic cartoon. Ignore space, and you're coupled to everybody. Turns out this is a gradient system. So the system goes to equilibrium. And just to give you a cartoon movie of what's happening, there are 5 individuals who wanted to go here. That's the heading. That's not a position. It's just a direction. 5 that wanted to go there. On the fast, and the black individuals are just followers. On the fast time scales, individuals organize themselves into the groups. And then on the slow time scales, you can look at the dynamics of the group. And so we write this down. For any particular group, Rj e to the I, Cj is the summation of all of the individuals in group J, so all the ones who wanted to go in direction 1, they're e to the I thetas. Then we differentiate, and then you can show that on a fast time scale, these form themselves into groups, and then we can write down the slow time scale equations, which I won't do for this system. I'll come back to that in just a moment. But there are a couple of conclusions. We found that naive individuals, meaning uninformed individuals, those that don't have any preferred direction, are crucial to consensus, that the non-spatial models explain some of the behavior but not everything, that we needed multi-scale analyses. And this reminded me in John's talk yesterday that we ought to look at models in which there were changing signals and boundaries. Individuals tended to change who they paid attention to. The network changed. And so this is a paper we published a year and a half ago in which we did this. Naomi Leonard is the first author in this, in which we set out to look at uninformed individuals, but the model was a little complicated. This looks exactly like what I wrote down before, except the theta j's can change as a function of time now. Well, they could in the other model as well. but these coupling parameters, A, J, the degree to which you pay attention to other individuals now changes as a function of time. And how do they change as a function of time? Well, I won't take you through the mathematics here, but I'll tell you what it says. Basically, it says that you tend to strengthen the connections to individuals in your neighborhood and weaken the connections to other individuals. And what you find is that the group self-organizes now into a number of different clusters. These are the dynamics on the slow time scales. These are the equations for the directionality of that, or actually for that summation function for that group. And the A's, which are the coupling terms, the capital A's that tell you how much you depend on the other groups, tend either to be zeros or one. And therefore, we can study the dynamics of the system, and it turns out it's very complicated. There are 8 possible invariant manifolds, and as many as 5 of them can be stable at any one time. So the system is very sensitive to initial conditions. Let me just turn to the last point, because Helga addressed this in her comments, and it was implicit in what Murray had to say as well. Systems of this sort are subject to conflict when they ought to be engaging in collective action. So they're models for our thinking about how we can address the environmental problems and the other problems that we face. Imagine this cartoon, which Danny Grunbaum developed when he was writing his thesis, but he didn't put it in his thesis, and I had to give him a copy last year. These are the krill that he studied. And the idea here is, suppose you're searching for resources, say, on some landscape. And this landscape has multiple peaks here. And the way you would do it probably is by hill climbing, just moving up the gradient. And that's good. That'll get you up maybe to this peak, maybe to this peak. But if you shared information, maybe everybody could get up to this peak. And so that tells you that probably it wouldn't be, it's not, the optimal thing is not for everybody to be going on their own. On the other hand, if everybody in those previous simulations did nothing but follow others, then everybody would end up, as you'll see, in a nice cluster, but it wouldn't have anything to do with the resource. So the optimal is something in between, some intermediate level of leadership and following some intermediate level of foraging and scavenging, either with some subset who are leaders and some who are followers, or everybody doing a little of each. But that's not the right way to look at this problem, because this is a game theoretic problem. I'm going to free ride on you. I don't care necessarily about what's good for the group. So we asked, how does selection shape the trade-off in this game theoretic situation between tracking resources and tracking individuals? How many leaders, how many followers? What is optimal from the viewpoint of the group? And I will justify that in the next slide. Naomi Leonard has a student who has looked at what rules that individuals ought to use to maximize the robustness of the group. And she found, or the student found, that individuals should pay attention to about their 6 or 7 nearest neighbors, which fits very well with observations. But the trouble is that, and we're looking at this now, there's no reason to believe that individuals will do what's in the best interest of the group. So we look for game theoretic solutions, and there are lessons here for cooperation in public goods situations. Other work I'm doing is on public goods resolution in which these insights are helpful. Now, Naomi, as I told you, what she does is she puts robots out in the ocean, and those robots exchange information with each other, and she's trying to optimize information games. So for her system, it's perfectly reasonable to ask what's optimal. But she got interested in how animal groups do this, and so we began working on models of fish population, where the optimization is at the local level. And in reality, in groups, there's probably some level of what economists call prosociality, caring about other individuals. And so the optimum is somewhere in between. So we're trying to look at what the consequences are of having selection at those different levels. We, which means the local group, I'm not an author on all of these papers, have published a series of papers that try to address this question. I won't talk about my paper with Colin Torney, but this is the paper that Vishu Guttal and Ian Cousin and maybe some others published. And first of all, they just said, well, there are 2 parameters now in this model. One is the investment you make in finding out where the resources are, and the other is the investment you make in finding out what others are doing. And first of all, we can vary these parameters. And if all you do is invest in following others, then you have a swarm, as I mentioned, but it's Brownian. It's just going to move around with no relation to resources. On the other hand, if you don't make an investment in either, then all the individuals will be randomly walking. If everybody puts their energy, their resources into detecting the gradient, then you'll get solitary migrations. It's only when you have investment in both that you get this collective motion in relationship to the gradient. And then they put this in an evolutionary model where they rewarded individuals based on their payoffs, allowed them to evolve, and according to some replicator scheme. And what they ended up with was a bifurcation of the population into leaders and followers. So the system self-organized. Another way to look at it was to look at it on this landscape. Collective action is the fundamental problem in dealing with sustainability, I think. William Forster Lloyd, nearly 200 years ago, talked about the commons, and Garrett Hardin popularized this in the 1950s by talking about the tragedy of the commons. He proposed a solution that Lynn Ostrom and others worked out called mutual coercion, mutually agreed upon. And again, this is what Murray and Helga sort of implied in their talk. How do you get collective action in the common good? Now, Locke, in his introductory remarks, mentioned this paper in which I am indeed an author, but Alessandro Tavoni and Maya Schluter are the lead authors, in which we asked, how can a norm arise in a particular, how do norms arise in a particular system? Big literature on this, and how can this lead to cooperation in the commons? And the idea is you had a resource and individuals are withdrawing from this resource. They can withdraw either at a selfish level, at a very high level, or they can withdraw at a mutually agreed upon norm. And obviously they do better, I won't write down the equations, they do better if they withdraw at a higher rate, except for the fact that the individuals who withdraw at the lower rate band together to ostracize them and punish them. Now we still have to put in, and I think Locke has already done this, some cost to the punishment. I mean, how do I ostracize you? I don't interact with you. Well, that's some cost to me as well. But that's not in this particular model. Maya, by the way, who's at the Stockholm Resilience Center, actually has done field work on this in Uzbekistan on water utilization systems. And what we found is that these systems have the potential for multiple stable states. This is the level of selfishness. That's how much more the selfish individuals withdraw. This is the frequency of cooperators. And so you can only sustain the norm if you can get above this level. But in that case, you get the potential for stability in the system. This is why a lot of international agreements are designed so that they only go into effect if the number of signatories is above a certain threshold. More generally, consensus may be emergent in systems. And with Ian and Naomi Leonard and a number of other collaborators, we published a paper last year in Science in which we looked, first of all, at the fish orientation model I showed you before. Secondly, at some experiments that Ian carries out. Ian is able to train fish to targets so that they become leaders. And he can modify, by giving them rewards, and he can modify the commitment. That is, he can modify the reward so that they become more strongly committed or weakly committed to that. In addition to that, we also looked at some models of consensus formation in human groups, and all of the models gave the same sort of behavior. If you have a strongly opinionated minority, then it can dominate what the majority wants to do. But as you increase the number of unopinionated individuals, this becomes more difficult to do. So we examined the probability of reaching the majority target in relationship to the number of unopinionated individuals, and it goes up. Eventually, it has to go down, because if the group's made up almost entirely of unopinionated individuals, it becomes 50-50. We also looked at this, I'll just give you an idea of the collective decision-making model we looked at for humans. There's a network with a large number of nodes. It's in which you give it, you initialize it with a mean degree 10 connections. And individuals can change their opinions. They change their opinions in relationship to what their neighbors are doing. And there's a nonlinear relationship. The more of your neighbors have the opposite opinion, the more likely you are to change. But you have an intrinsic opinion, at least some individuals do, and you're much more likely to spontaneously flip back to that. And finally, just as in the fish model, you can make or break links depending on your similarity to your neighbors. So this model gives rise to the same sort of behavior. Indeed, don't have time to go into it, but it turns out there's a bistability in this system as well. So let me finish up and draw some conclusions. Collective phenomena and emergence characterize a wide variety of systems, almost all systems, from microbial committees up to the communities, up to microbes form committees too, up to the biosphere. So a fundamental challenge of this is for how to scale from the microscopic to the macroscopic, from individuals to get a crude look at the whole. Conflict and cooperation are challenges in all systems. And there's a lot of literature as to how this is resolved, not just in human systems, but how we get collective motion. Indeed, multicellularity is a form of collective action, which is one of the major transitions in evolutionary theory. I took this off the web yesterday to indicate that conflict and cooperation are going on even within our own bodies, as we have selfish DNA and elements that are competing with each other. And finally, I hope I've convinced you that approaches from complexity theory, particular techniques from mathematics and physics, not only can inform our resolution of these problems, but also that examination of these problems can, as it's historically done, stimulate mathematics to look at new sorts of problems and to provide new life. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Professor Simon Levin, for the fascinating talk. Yep, so let's go for questions. Alfred, please.
The mathematics. So it is very beautiful when we have an idea of how to generate the local rules, and then we simulate and get the global behavior. But sometimes, especially in robotics and in engineering disciplines, we would like a global behavior to emerge, and we would like to derive the local rules. How good is mathematics in solving such problems? So you are given a group of individuals that have a certain set of capabilities. They can only see this far, they can only move this fast, and so forth. And now you'd like to derive the rules of the local interactions in order to get the global view.
So there are really two possible interpretations of your question, both interesting. One is the reverse engineering. That is, we see some phenomenon and we ask, what's really going on in this system? And the other thing, the other possible interpretation is we desire some phenomenon. How can we engineer a system to achieve that? So both of those are interesting. In the first case, we have to recognize, and I made some allusions to this, that there are multiple ways you can get the same sorts of behaviors. So whenever, and that's why catastrophe theory collapsed, whenever we see that a particular sort of phenomenon can give rise to a particular kind of behavior, we have to be cognizant of the fact that there are other ways to get there too. And I don't know any simple way to do this exhaustively, but the hope is to create a catalog of how many different ways you can get this, and then to design experiments to help distinguish among them. So let me just give you an example for the animal aggregation patterns, we know that animals are obviously using local rules. But are they responding to the positions of their neighbors or their velocities of their neighbors? Models that assume positions or models that assume velocities will give rise to many of the same sorts of phenomena, but they will give rise to different phenomena. So the model, for example, if you're only responding to the velocities of other individuals, then those groups tend to be much less stable. They can break apart much more easily. So you try to look at the models to provide other ways you could distinguish. A second sort of question there is, are individuals responding to all of the other individuals in some geometric neighborhood, which is what was assumed for a long time, or is it some topological neighborhood, namely the 7 nearest neighbors? And so you design experiments, you design measurements as ways to try to distinguish among them. So these sorts of models are only helpful as a way to start thinking about these problems and to design the experiments or the measurements that have to be made. So I can't give you a general answer to how good mathematics is at doing that. You know that better than I. The second question is also an interesting one, but there you don't care necessarily whether you've got the right mechanism. In fact, one of the first models of this sort I heard at Santa Fe by a guy named Craig Reynolds, who designed a program called Boyd's. And what he was really interested in was, I think he was working for Lucas Studios or something of that sort. He wanted to build movement models. So he didn't care if he had the right model. He would build in certain rules, and if they gave him behaviors that he didn't like, he would change the local rules until he got it. And Naomi Leonard is in that position with the robots that she's putting out in the field. It's up to her what rules she wants to give. Her hope is that finding out how evolution has solved these problems over millions of years will give her a leg up on rules to use. So she was very happy with it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the power law somewhere along the talk. I didn't understand it fully, but I wanted to ask the question, which is a bit of a follow-up to Freddie's question just now. Jeffrey West has talked quite a bit about power laws, about cities and GDP and various other economic factors. Do you have any insights about what fundamental behavior might have created this power law relationship that he seems to observe? And I think he talked about the living organisms as well.
Do you mean why I get the power laws in our model, or why Jeffrey West gets the power laws?
Why Jeffrey West gets the power law, but of course starting with how you got the power law.
Let me emphasize again, there are lots of different ways to get power laws. The sorts of allometric scaling relationships that Brown, West, and Enquist addressed have been of fundamental interest in ecology for a long time. There are lots of theories about it. They developed a very convincing model of branching networks, for example, in bronchial trees, with certain limitations on what the smallest branch could be at the end, that gave rise to the scaling networks. And I find their explanations there persuasive. They have also extended those to a variety of other branching networks that I find less persuasive. And let me give you the reason why. Bronchial trees embedded in your chest are subject to natural selection to, if not optimize, at least improve. And so the pattern, their argument was based on an optimization argument, and I thought that that was applicable to that situation. When you extend it to the branching networks that real trees show, either their above-ground branches or their roots, then there's another factor that comes in that's not included in those models, namely one of the purposes of developing branching networks is to shade out your neighbors. It's not just to gather information, to gather resources. And so you really have to approach this, I think, as a game theoretic problem. I think a lot of the aspects of the geometry of trees is not just how do I get the most resource, but how do I interfere with my neighbors most effectively. The same thing with root network, branching network. They've also been interested, or at least Jeffrey has, in extending this to power law relationships that emerge in the dynamics of cities, banking systems, et cetera. That's yet another level of abstraction, because those are really emergent properties where all the optimization, if any, is going on at much more local scales. So I don't find the optimization arguments persuasive in those cases. I don't know why one gets power law relationships in those systems, because we know that there are lots of different ways. I showed you in the simple model we had of vegetation patterns that one got power law relationships. Karabakh argued you got them out of self-organized criticality. You certainly get them in certain phase transitions. There are lots of ways you can get power laws. Mark Newman at Michigan has written one of the best papers I've seen on this, where he indicates all the various ways you can get power law relationships. I think in any particular situation, you then have to go back to Freddie's question, which is, how do I distinguish among these competing hypotheses? And I have no general answer for that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
There's a question by George.
Hi, this might be a small detail, but I think it's a question I have. So in your models, do you incorporate risk preferences, or do you assume that all agents are risk neutral? And do you allow for variability in risk preferences?
In which models do you mean?
All the like animal models, or models that include agents, that have value functions.
So the answer to your question is, in some of our models, and I'll tell you which ones, but you haven't seen them yet, we've incorporated risk preferences. There are no risk preferences in the aggregation models, because there's no optimization going on. All that's going on is individuals are given local rules and say, this is the way you're going to behave. Now, it's natural to ask, what would the optimal behavior be? And the only extent to which we've looked at that, and what I told you about, is we've looked at simulations. Well, I'll give you a footnote to that, but we've looked at simulations in which individuals are put into competition, they get certain rewards, and based on that, they produce multiple copies. And then, so if there's risk aversion going on, it's emergent. Now, there's one case where that's not true. I didn't talk to you about it at all. We've looked at the situation where animals can invest in information that helps it to move in a particular direction. This is the paper with Colin Torney. There's stochastic noise that's imposed on top of that system. And so the behavior, and we do that analytically, and the behaviors that emerge there don't include the risk preferences, but they include reaction to uncertainty. Same thing would be true in the Tavoni Schluter model. I've been doing work that I didn't talk to you about with Avinash Dixit, a well-known game theorist and economist, in which we've been interested in the following question. We're interested in how individuals deal with uncertainty and how they develop insurance arrangements. And the particular case study we took were herdsmen in East Africa. What the herdsmen do is they share grazing ground. So I say to you, I'm having a bad year here. Can I send my cattle to graze on your land? And you say, why should I let you do that? And I say, well, because next year the situation may be reversed, and then you can send your cattle to me. So we compute what, if I'm in charge of moving cattle around, what the social optimum would be. We then ask, is it stable in a game theoretic sense? And finally, we ask, if it's not, is there what an economist would call a second best solution? Namely, you say to me, I don't want all your cattle, but you could send me 10 cattle. And I understand that means next year I could only send you 10. So that's a constrained optimization problem. Now, risk comes in two ways in those calculations. First of all, the utility functions have a nonlinearity that reflects risk aversion. So we certainly build that in. And secondly, the answer to the question of whether you'll accept my deal depends on how much you value next year relative to this year. So what your discount rate is. So in that model, risk aversion comes in really in two different ways. But these models were, for the most part, not optimization models, so that issue doesn't arise.
Thank you for this very enlightening speech. I have one question. Have you ever seen from any local behaviors, nepotism evolves?
I didn't know where you were.
Sorry, yeah. Nepotism evolves. Have you ever seen that, like a very classic phenomena of Indian humans, equilibriums are nepotism is part of it. I'm studying nepotism as a part of like financial, investment industry, mutual funds, and things like this. So basically, let me define you what I mean by nepotism. That essentially a weaker, in every sense, a dominated species is present, but a species that is closely in contact with a powerful species before will be the leader, just because of his. So it's a weight on one on this contact rather than on any other criteria that determine, say, a realization of objective function. So have you seen in any other species a nepotist behavior?
So you said this is nepotism. That's
yes.
It's certainly not in their models. I'm sure that there are species in which the leadership is determined to some extent by a hierarchy. We know that there are species where leadership is determined by a hierarchy, that hierarchy certainly could be related to both previous degrees of contact, individuals in the group, and relatedness. So it's not a uniquely human phenomenon. I can't think of any models that have really looked at that sort of behavior. That would be interesting to do, unless you think about work and people. There are other people here who would know more about this than I would in social insects and things of that sort, or maybe even other primate groups in which the leadership structure is known. I don't know anything about that though, but I'm sure that it happens in primate groups.
Chris.
That was a wonderful talk. I feel a little bit like a goose who's been fattened up for pâté de foie gras. There's so much to absorb from it.
That may be what's out there for
another. I work in the area of public policy, and I'm always interested in the issue of translating work such as yours into an analogous of agricultural extension bulletins, let's say, which could be given to congressional staff members or briefed for congressional testimony. And if I can use an example, for example, Elizabeth Pate Cornell's work at Stanford was applied to analysis of risk considerations in the crash of the Concorde and also the oil well in New Orleans. And I'm just wondering if there is an extension service affiliate of your work that is doing that kind of thing.
Not in the sense you mean. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But for example, following our there's a story I want to tell at the end too, if I remember. From the 2008 work, there were follow-ups. By the way, that paper arose from a meeting, or as a result of a meeting that Timothy Geithner helped organize at the New York Fed on systemic risk. This was before the collapse. And afterwards, the World Economic Forum organized a special year on systemic risk, in which I was a consultant. Shows you how much they know. And to translate this, and I've been consulting regularly for the Boston Consulting Group, which it's trying to translate this sort of information on vulnerability, adaptability, those ecological and evolutionary issues into terms that companies can understand. So consulting groups of that sort to play the role of this extension service. Now, I actually think that this work at the end on decision-making in fish schools and things of that sort, and consensus formation in human groups has a lot of implications for societal problems. And indeed, some of our work is funded by the military, which is obviously interested in that, as well as just issues of troop deployments and things of that sort. Nonetheless, our work was singled out recently by Senator Coburn from Oklahoma, and most recently by Rand Paul, prospective presidential candidate, for an example of how the government could save money by not funding it. I mean, their argument being, what can we possibly learn from fish about human societies? So I think this ignorance of the fact that animal models have done so much for us is a good example of why we need an extension service, but I'm not sure how much good it would do. But corporations are interested in the lessons that can be learned from this. Sure.
There are 3 questions coming, so the first for Chris.
Chris Monterola from IHPC. You have discussed a lot of diverse work, diverse systems, and in these diverse systems, you actually use a different technique to understand or solve them, from agent-based to Karamoto model to
so
diffusion.
when you say you don't mean me, you mean people do.
Yeah. Okay. Essentially.
Okay.
Now, eventually, in your conclusion, you mentioned that conflict and cooperations are challenges in all these systems, are common features in all of these systems, which mathematically, at least in my intuition, can mean essentially conflict could probably be some sort of a diffusion process, because you try to maximize the resources, and cooperation can be some sort of an aggregation process, and which somehow translates to this idea that at least for differential equations, we have what is referred to as a diffusion reaction differential equation used in Turing systems, where you have these 2 opposing mechanisms incorporated, or probably in the nonlinear Schrodinger equation, you also have this nonlinearity and diffusion term. Now, my question is whether there is a fundamental reason why another ingredients, which you referred to as some sort of a collective phenomena, cannot be captured or incorporated in these differential equations to have some sort of a master equation in trying to understand these diverse systems.
I don't think anything I said should be taken to imply that you can't do that, but I want to encourage some caution, and let me give you a simple example. So when Rick Durrett, at the beginning, and just in passing, I showed these interacting particle models. Now, there are various ways to model spatial pattern formations. First of all, you can ignore space entirely and just build a mean field model. But if you want to incorporate space, then you can put things into local patches, sort of a metapopulation model. You can have a reaction diffusion model, and you can have this interacting particle model like we had here. So when we set out to try to understand pattern formation, we began from the interacting particle model, and what we found is that it predicted phenomena, and I'm not going to get into the details unless you really want me to. The particular aspects of the kinds of patterns that form could not be predicted by the diffusion reaction models. Whereas, well, let me come back to why. The main reason they couldn't is because diffusion, as you know, assumes infinite speed of propagation. And therefore, that meant that everything was everywhere almost immediately. Not at the same level, but everything was everywhere. And that meant that the sorts of patterns that were forming in our system, which relied on a time lag before species B could displace species A, couldn't be sustained. So what we did then is we said something similar to what I did with Glenn Flarrell and Danny Grunbaum for the fish models. Can we start from the individual-based models and using formal methods derive the diffusion limit? Derive the diffusion limit in the correct way. So you have a stochastic process, and you can derive a diffusion approximation to it. And that's what we did. And those worked very well. But they were different than the diffusion approximation that you would get just by slapping a diffusion term onto the reaction dynamics. And basically, the reaction dynamics are what had been changed in that model. So I think the answer is that there should be a goal to develop a master equation or some macroscopic description. A lot of the stuff I showed you was in that spirit. But if you're going to do that, make sure you start from the mechanisms to try to understand what is the correct continuum limit to get out of the model. Because what we had done, what Siegel and I did initially, what the Turing models did initially, is just said, well, let's just take the reaction dynamics between predator and prey and add diffusion at different rates, and let's see what happens. And the predictions we got didn't work there in that case because we were assuming random diffusion, but we didn't have the correct diffusion limit.
Okay.
Okay?
Okay.
Hello. Yeah. Some human natures, like collusion and cheating and speculation.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that. What
So some human nature, such as collusion and cheating and speculation, may lead to some disaster. Such nature may not be found in animals other than human beings. So could you elaborate more on how we can extend or apply your model to analyze such human behavior?
To other, first of all, a lot of the behaviors that you think don't apply to other animals do apply to other animals. Bacteria deal with public goods problems all the time. Bacteria produce extracellular polymers that form the matrix for growth, the biofilms that help support your dentist. They provide signals for quorum sensing by which one individual can signal others. So understanding why bacteria should do this, under what circumstances they should invest in these extracellular polymers, et cetera, is a fundamental public goods problem. There's a lot of work going on in public goods problems in bacteria now. But public goods problems arise in many other organisms. Nitrogen fixation by plants is a public goods problem. Water uptake by plants is a public good problem. All animal groups are dealing with a variety of public goods problems and evolve cooperation and things of that sort. Now, that's not to say that I think that everything is the same as we move up to higher levels of complexity. But my approach to modeling is to try to start from the simplest models and ask how much of the behavior that we observe can this explain. And I think, for example, that the herd behavior that we see in an animal population can explain a lot of the things that people do in terms of decision making. There are very few individuals who really have the capability or the desire to think through and make decisions themselves, so they attach themselves to others. They listen to Fox News or whatever and to find out what it is they ought to believe. So I think it's worthwhile to find out how much of why people do what they do is influenced by others. But then we have to, of course, to turn attention to the unique problems of human societies and how they make decisions. And so I've become very interested in social norm formation, which I think is the most crucial factor. And now, to some extent, social norms form in other animal groups as well. Animals ostracize each other, et cetera. But obviously, it's different in human groups. So there are lots of experiments that that drive economists crazy. For example, in the ultimatum game, do you know what this is? But others won't. So in the ultimatum game, I offer him $100,000, which he has to share with Freddie, whom he's never met before and will never see again. And Freddie knows the rules of this game, which is he has to offer a certain fraction, which Freddie either accepts or declines. If Freddie accepts it, everything's fine. If he declines it, there's no negotiation. Neither one of them gets anything. So, for example, I play this in my class, and the student offers $30,000, and the other student turns it down. I said, it's costing you $30,000. She said, yeah, but it's costing him $70,000. Well, so humans do all sorts of things. Now, that's an extreme example, and I don't think if she really thought I was going to give her the $100,000, she would have done this. But anthropologists have played the ultimatum game in different societies, for example, and they find what people will offer and what they will accept differ a great deal. So we certainly have to look at social norm formation, why this seemingly irrational behavior arises, how social norms arise and are established, and how they're maintained, and how they differ among cultures. So I don't for a minute suggest that by studying fish schools we can understand human societies. But I think we can understand a lot about human societies and collective behavior. And indeed, a lot of the behaviors are the same behaviors you'd get with molecules, just the emergent properties, the law of large numbers, lots of individual interactions will give rise to predictable statistical behaviors. The question is, how much of the behaviors does that explain? And when do we have to begin to look and introduce new mechanisms?
Thank you. Greg Fisher. This links quite well with some of the comments you just finished on. In the years before she died, Elinor Ostrom, paraphrasing, said, we lack a coherent, overarching sort of framework of collective action in human systems. And I think she's absolutely right, and it's critical we develop that. And I think that a major contribution that complexity science can make in the social system, in social science, is to develop some sort of coherent framework for collective action, and metaphorically have a sort of conversation with political philosophy. Okay, because I deal day to day with politicians, and I'm up against ideology, political ideology, and I talk about collective action in complex social systems, and it doesn't really mix well with some ideology. Is anybody working on this sort of Ostrom sort of claim that we need this?
Well, Lynn, of course, has a whole bunch of disciples who are working, including people like me, who just had the pleasure of interacting with her. One of the ideas, and I talked to Bob Axelrod about this the other day, that Lynn was advocating, and an idea that she got from her husband, Vincent, was that the steps to international agreements have to begin locally, and so she talked about polycentric approaches. I don't know that there's any theory for that that's the right way to go, and when I've talked to Scott Barrett and others, who's one of the leading people trying to develop international agreements on climate change and the like, about these sorts of, these sorts of approaches. There's a feeling in some that this approach wouldn't work for Kyoto, and in fact, Kyoto failed because it didn't think big enough at the beginning. So I find fascinating, although it's not yet an area of expertise for me, the issue of how do you build to international consensus. I'm very influenced by what Lynn had to say about polycentric approaches, local approaches, and building up. But I think, starting as an evolutionary biologist, where there's been a lot of literature on cooperation and cooperation among groups. Murray asked the other day, why is it that groups have to fight with each other? Well, I think in part the answer to that is they have evolved cooperation because they gain benefits, nonlinear benefits in the group, largely in competition with other groups. And so that this competition with other groups is an intrinsic property. Anthony Appiah, my colleague at Princeton, talks about the other, namely that groups are much more likely to be hostile to other groups that are somewhat similar, that they've been in contact with in the past, than groups that they've never had contact with, because there's a need to distinguish themselves from those other groups. So I think we have to find ways to get up to, you're absolutely right, it's the crucial problem, and that we're not getting through to politicians. So I'm certainly interested in talking to anybody who has ideas about that, but you'll be not surprised to know I don't have the answer.
Okay, we have the last question by Marcus.
Okay. Yeah, one of the peculiarities of human systems and collective action is actually that they're as many have said, they're usually more complicated than the rather simple optimality or optimization problems here. So one of
game
the
theoretic.
Yes, also. Well, one of the bigger problems is that people have different rank-ordered preferences. And in your experiments, there's usually one kind of preference or one kind of optimality. So do you have any experiments or insights done with different rank-ordered preferences?
Well, I think that's a really fascinating problem. Humans are voting all the time. One of the most interesting aspects, the only one where I've sort of touched on this, is something called hyperbolic discounting. Now, we all know we discount the future at particular rates, and you and I discount at different rates, but we're probably more similar than politicians or CEOs who have much steeper discount rates. But what may be surprising to you is that you don't discount the future at a constant rate. You discount the future what's called hyperbolically. And this can be determined by which I mean you use a much higher rate for the short term than you do for the long term. And it's easy to do experiments, even with birds, to demonstrate this. Birds have to push a button. They get a reward for pushing the button. But they're two different buttons. They get different rewards, but they're delayed. And so you can trade off. You can see how they trade off delay against the level of the reward. And humans do the same thing. So this has implications. It means that every morning, and this is true, when I get up, I say, I know there's going to be, that Jan has organized a great reception tonight with all sorts of cakes and things that I shouldn't eat, and when I get there, I'm not going to eat them. And then I come there, and I say, well, I'll start that tomorrow. They really look pretty good. And that's because I'm using a steeper discount rate in the evening than I did in the morning, referring to the same time period. So it leads to what's called intertemporal inconsistency. And therefore, in the morning, I might say, well, maybe the thing to do is not even to go to the reception, then I won't be tempted. So there's a conflict between the you in the morning and the you in the evening. Now, why might this arise? Well, there are various explanations having to do with uncertainty and things of that sort, but very simply, if you aggregate together different discount rates, you get something that's more or less hyperbolic. Not exactly hyperbolic, but steeper in the short term when the steepest discount rate comes into effect. And so societies probably discount hyperbolically for that reason. But you probably discount hyperbolically as well because you have different criteria. You're saying, on the one hand, I like the food. On the other hand, I like to stay healthy. And so you're trading off. And there may be different regions of the brain even.
Well, the way I meant it actually was very specifically politically because when you vote for a party, for instance, you don't agree with all their precepts. But you have a certain rank order, and then on average, you take this decision. And different individuals have different rank orders for these preferences, and that leads to this irreconcilable.
I still think it's related to the same thing, because if I agree with you in terms of certain features, and I don't, and that model that we looked at actually.
Yours is a temporal inconsistency, but you also have sort of a synoptic inconsistency in the opinions that cannot be aggregated,
yes,
essentially.
The temporal inconsistency, however, results because I've got different criteria. This is important to me and this is important to me, and I have to vote. So if I'm dealing with a situation where I have different, I agree with you on some of the things you're saying, and this is true, and don't agree with you on others, and I have to decide whether on balance I'm going to align with you, I'm voting. And I'm trying to balance these things. So, well, go ahead, you don't.
I agree on that, but the problem in voting is essentially that depending on how you design the voting system, you get different results.
No, but I
So
mean,
the-
I'm voting myself. I've got different regions of me or different components of me that are balancing each other. And indeed, how I aggregate that, of course, is going to affect the outcome. This is not an area of my expertise, but I certainly find it's an area that I find interesting as to how you trade off those aggregations. And in that model I went by briefly close to the end, the network model of human decision making, every or many of the individuals had intrinsic preferences, and they have to decide, do I stay a Democrat, do I stay a Republican, or do I bolt and go with what my intrinsic preferences are? So they're trading it off in that model. I agree that that's a very interesting problem.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's time for us to close the session. So before that, let me thank Professor Simon Levin for his wonderful talk and answering all the questions.
Thank you.